After roughly a year of speculating whether Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy would retire, he finally announced this past June he would be stepping down from the bench. With Kennedy's retirement from the court, it creates an opening. It didn't take long for President Trump to announce his potential replacement, Brett Kavanaugh. I recently reached out to Jeff Hauser from the Revolving Door Project, who has been covering the Kavanaugh hearings, to discuss about Kavanaugh's history and what we should expect if he replaces Anthony Kennedy on the Supreme Court. Brett Kavanaugh worked under Alex Kozinski, who was on the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Kozinski recently retired at the end of 2017 under a cloud of controversy. Can you tell me exactly what happened there and how that involves Kavanaugh?
Kozinski was a extremely influential judge on the Ninth Circuit for nearly 30 years. 10 years ago, it became known that he had hosted pornography on a Ninth Circuit web server, which raised an enormous number of eyebrows, but ended up dismissed, unfortunately, as kind of like, well, he's a quirky guy and he's kind of libertarian, and so isn't that okay? But over time, the loud whispers in the legal community about how Judge Kozinski treated women and the workplace environment that he created and the just really ridiculous behavior, between sexual harassment to worse, that he demonstrated in all sorts of settings, that open secret became kind of a better known and underwent more scrutiny, and he was under actual official investigation by the Ninth Circuit, an investigation that he managed to shortcut by resigning. So he basically quit in order to avoid an official determination about his actions. And unfortunately, because we don't have a Congress that does oversight in 2018, there's really been no follow-up action by the government with respect to Kozinski's decades of misbehavior. And how this relates to Judge Kavanaugh is that Kavanaugh was one of Kozinski's earliest clerks. He actually secured the clerkship when another future Republican star, Alex Azar, left after 6 weeks under conditions we still don't really know anything about. Azar now is the Secretary of Health and Human Services and went on to work for Ken Starr and the Special Counsel's Office in the late 90s and has done all sorts of things. Kavanaugh took that position, hit it off with Kozinski, stayed friends for the next 25 years, worked with Kozinski in order to identify clerks to work for Justice Kennedy, for whom each of them clerked. In the end, Judge Kavanaugh employed Judge Kozinski's son as one of his clerks on the D.C. Circuit. So this is a very tight-knit protege-mentor relationship that Kavanaugh and Kozinski have enjoyed for more than 25 years.
So I just want to understand this. So Kozinski retired at the end of 2017 under investigation for sexual harassment and other disturbing things about hosting pornography and viewings, and Kavanaugh clerked for him. Is that correct?
Yeah, so he clerked for him more than 25 years ago. Then they've done all sorts of work together, essentially served on the committee to help Justice Kennedy choose his clerks. They've done writing projects and introduced each other at speeches. Judge Kozinski introduced now Judge Kavanaugh to the Judiciary Committee in 2006, the Senate Judiciary Committee. They are very close, and Kavanaugh has long been identified as a protege of Judge Kozinski. And Judge Kozinski is notorious for his sexual harassment, and this was an open secret in legal elite circles well beyond the universe of people who specifically clerked for Judge Kozinski.
Has anyone asked Kavanaugh if he knew about this? Is there any indication that he was aware of this, that he witnessed this?
In testimony before the Judiciary Committee, he denied knowing about any sexual harassment. And then in follow-up written questions from Senate Democrats, he was asked to review his archives because he had denied ever receiving emails on something that was called the gag list. Kozinski, for decades, maintained an email list in which he would send sexually explicit jokes, and he regularly included all of his clerks on it, often not even asking them to opt in. They just automatically got included on his list of sexually explicit jokes. Kavanaugh asked to search his email archive to refresh his memory that he had not ever heard of this email list before it was written up in the Los Angeles Times. All he did in response to that request was say that I still do not recall being on this email list. He did not claim to have actually done the search of his email address for the Kaczynski gag list.
After working for Kaczynski, Kavanaugh landed the job working for independent counsel Ken Starr. What was his role with Ken Starr?
One of his big roles was to try to track down the Vince Foster story. There was a cottage industry of conspiracists in the 1990s that said that Vince Foster had not committed suicide, but rather was murdered by the Clintons because that he had knowledge of illegalities in Arkansas. Vince Foster having been a member of the White House counsel's office under Bill Clinton in Washington, D.C., who had worked with Hillary Clinton back in Arkansas and had known the Clintons for a long time. There's all sorts of reason to believe that Vince Foster, who was known to be depressed, committed suicide, and that was what the police determined. But when Starr took over the special counsel office from Robert Fisk in the mid-1990s, because Republican judges on the D.C. Circuit judged Robert Fisk, a moderate Republican, to be insufficiently partisan for their case. When Ken Starr got the office, he decided to put one of his young rising star conservatives, Brett Kavanaugh, on the matter. And so he spent a couple of years digging into conspiracy theories about Vince Foster. He also was just one of the top lieutenants to Ken Starr overall, including writing memos about why it was so important to ask Bill Clinton extremely detailed questions about his sexual activities with Monica Lewinsky.
After the Ken Starr investigation wraps up, where did Kavanaugh go from there?
So Kavanaugh clerked for Justice Kennedy and then pretty quickly, if not immediately, went to Starr's office. Then he briefly left Starr's office to go to Kirkland & Ellis as a partner. That was the law firm that Ken Starr had been a partner at previously and was a very influential right-wing law firm at the time, and still is. He did a second stint at the special counsel's office under Ken Starr, then went back to Kirkland & Ellis. So he spent 2 stints at Kirkland & Ellis through the end of 2000. In the end of 2000, he was one of many lawyers involved in Bush's effort to determine the winner of the 2000 presidential election, Florida recount. And then following that service, he was hired as part of Bush's White House counsel team in January of 2001. He then spent more than 2 years in the White House counsel's office, where he was a leading force on judicial nominations as well as the post-9/11 response by the Bush administration. And then after that, he became staff secretary, which is the job that basically determines what information gets to the president. So it's a very senior job, despite the title being a little enigmatic.
Okay, so I just want to understand this. So he did one stint on Ken Starr's independent counsel team. Then he left, went to go to a law firm that Ken Starr had worked at. Then he left that law firm to go back to Ken Starr while he was still doing this investigation.
Right. This is when it was heating up, and Ken Starr was writing his report to the congressional Republicans, and during the Lewinsky saga and then the recommendation of impeachment. He did 2 stints in total at Kirkland & Ellis. The first was roughly 4 to 6 months. The second stint was roughly 2 years.
There sounds like there's a lot of controversy surrounding some emails that were stolen from Democratic senators during the Bush era, and that involved Brett Kavanaugh. Can you explain what that is all about?
Yeah, so their computers being a little bit more expensive and the downsides of computer security issues being a little less well known at that point in time, there were different Democratic and Republican files on servers in the Senate for the Senate Judiciary Committee staffs. And a man by the name of Manuel Miranda, senior Republican Senate staffer, realized that he could access, without the Democrats knowing it, their internal files. And so he spent a couple of years during a time of enormous fights over judicial nominations between Senate Democrats and George W. Bush, stealing the internal correspondence of the Senate Democrats. And one of the things he did with that information was share it with the White House counsel's office, frequently with Brett Kavanaugh, although not limited to Brett Kavanaugh. and he did so in a pretty brazen way. He sent emails with subject heads like spying, and then he would use a term when he talk about his mole within the Senate Democrats. But of course, there's no such thing as a mole in Washington, D.C. politics on the Senate side, whereby like Republicans are actually secret Democrats or vice versa. That's not like how real life works. People, choose their political party well in advance and, build out resumes that fit one party or the other. And so Miranda shared all sorts of stolen materials with Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh was asked about this during his two different hearings to be a D.C. Circuit judge. He had hearings in 2004 and 2006 because he had such a reputation as a partisan hack that Democrats were able to kill off his nomination. Initially in 2004, they then failed to do so again in 2006. But he was asked about whether or not he had received stolen emails and said he had not, which almost certainly had to be a knowing lie because there's no other explanation for the sourcing of the documents that he had received from Miranda. Miranda had basically admitted in the documents by calling one of them spying. There's also indications they had off-site meetings that were alluded to in emails, whereby there was probably conversation about, one assumes but does not know, that there was conversation about what the basis for Miranda's confidence about what Democrats were and were not going to do and what emails they were seeing and what documents they were sharing. And so he was asked a bunch of questions about this before Democrats had any email correspondence with which to confirm or deny his answers, and he and Kavanaugh denied having received stolen documents in 2004 and 2006. Flash forward to 2018, and while most Kavanaugh documents from his time in the Bush White House have not been made available to the Senate committee, enough documents have been made available to make clear that it is extremely implausible that Kavanaugh was telling the truth when he testified in 2004 and 2006 about never having received stolen emails.
So let me ask you this. So you're saying they didn't have these documents back then, back in 2006, but they got them now, 12 years after 2006, so 2018. How are they not able to get these documents back then?
It relates to the Presidential Records Act, and there's a process whereby once an administration is out of office, documents have to be retained by the National Archives, and the National Archives is trying to provide documents from the time in which Kavanaugh was at the White House counsel's office, not when he was staff secretary, which is a separate controversy. But they're not going to be able to complete that review until mid to late October. And so in the interim, these are just documents that Brett Kavanaugh's former deputy, who's been hired by George W. Bush, William Burke, is providing some of the materials to the Senate, but not all, separate from the National Archive process. But those documents would have been considered subject to executive privilege during the time of Bush's presidency, so they were not made available to Senate Democrats at that time. So Kavanaugh was able to get away with making statements without risk of being proven a liar at the time.
So we have these documents now in 2018, and it shows that he denied it back then, and I assume he's denying it still?
He's basically claiming that his answers were technically accurate, even if deeply misleading. That's what essentially is the upshot of his characterization, that he doesn't say anything was wrong. Basically, the parts that came up in the hearing would be Senate Democrats who didn't actually have all the documents to disprove some of his claims at that time, because this rolling production process has been occurring later than the hearings themselves. They would say, how can you square this email with what you said in 2004 or 2006? And he's saying, I've always been honest. And he won't engage in any of the details to explain why the apparent contradiction between what he did know and what he said. He just doesn't engage with it.
Just to back up for a little bit here, you had said that Brett Kavanaugh was known as a partisan hack. What do you mean by that? Why would he be known as a partisan hack?
Because of his time on the Ken Starr team, he was known to be one of the members of the Starr team who had the most extreme views and who also talked to some of the most most extreme outlets of the right-wing media and saw them as his compatriots. He was close with his work for Ken Starr made a lot of enemies. Then his work on the Bush v. Gore litigation and just the general the Florida stuff, he was considered to be, again, kind of someone who didn't really have legal principles first and foremost in mind, but rather political partisan advantage. He started speaking out against the special counsel law shortly after working for the special counsel, which struck more than a few people as hypocritical at the time. He did work in conjunction with Elian Gonzalez in 2000, where he was pretty dishonest in his characterization of the law and the facts. And then his work on the judicial nomination process, those fights were really, really bitter between Senate Democrats and the White House counsel's office, including Brett Kavanaugh. It was just his general reputation in Washington, D.C. was of the type of person that Republicans hire when they have a scandal or a controversy, which is why a lot of progressives and just rule of law people have been particularly concerned about him going on the Supreme Court while Donald Trump is a potential litigant at the Supreme Court on complex issues of executive power.
To back up here for a minute, we've talked about for the 2004-2006 nomination process. In 2007, Democratic Senators Patrick Leahy and Dick Durbin accused Kavanaugh of misleading the Senate Judiciary Committee during his testimony to them. What were they saying that they believed he misled them on?
Well, I mean, I think while they didn't have the precise emails that would come out later kind of confirming that Manuel Miranda, the thief of Senate documents, was in touch, they had a lot of reason to suspect his dishonesty, and there were specific questions also raised about his role in post 9/11 civil liberties infringement, and he denied working on a lot of the more controversial aspects of the Bush administration's response to 9/11, and there was reason even then to believe that Kavanaugh was not telling the truth, and that reason has been accentuated since. And essentially, the only defenses of Kavanaugh that exist are essentially that he managed to successfully avoid committing perjury by carefully misleading without lying. And I think some of these defenses are wrong, and sometimes they're accurate. But that, you kind of hope for a little bit better in a Supreme Court justice than he, at times, artfully misleads the Senate rather than lying to it.
So we've mentioned 9/11 and the Bush administration response to that. What exactly does that involve with Brett Kavanaugh?
So Brett Kavanaugh in the White House counsel's office, the White House counsel's office often doesn't do the deep legal analysis or research on behalf of the executive branch, but they will sort of orchestrate that response. And so Kavanaugh was one of the people communicating with the Justice Department generally and the Office of Legal Counsel in particular about legal questions. The Office of Legal Counsel at that time included people like John Yoo, who authored the now infamous torture memo, and generally the Office of Legal Counsel in the early years of Bush is considered to be sort of a low point in rule of law in America, since the Japanese internment, and at least until the Trump administration. That was one of the low points. And so he was in communication with those people, even if not the principal architect of the controversial takes on civil liberties that the Bush administration put together.
To fast forward now, how long has Brett Kavanaugh been on the 10th Circuit?
He's been on the D.C. Circuit since 2006.
So 12 years.
A dozen years.
I see there's widespread belief that if Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, he'll shield Trump from prosecution. What is the reasoning behind this belief?
He has written and also participated in panels and so spoken and raised his hand even once when asked a question. He has, in various ways, communicated some of the most extreme ideas about the idea that the administration, the executive branch is what's called unitary, and the president is in charge. And so the executive branch, which is then defined as anything that is not the legislature itself or the courts, is run by the president. And that unitary executive belief, which also leads him to some outrageous views on issues like consumer protection, because he has problems with the CFPB and independent agencies more generally, like the SEC and FTC and FCC. This extreme view essentially means that Mueller couldn't charge Trump because Trump could just tell Mueller, don't charge me, and Mueller has to listen because there is no executive branch that can contradict Trump, that Trump is essentially dictator of the executive branch. Beyond just that, he has stated that he doesn't believe that presidents should have to answer subpoenas, should be subject to any sort of divergence from doing their job. Basically, he says that the president's really, really busy. I learned this working with George W. Bush in light of 9/11, putting forth an image of George W. Bush, I believe at odds with anyone who lived through the time period and does not recall George W. Bush being a nose-to-the-grindstone, detail-oriented president who was working 100-hour weeks. That was not our impression. But he has used that as justification to basically say that any sort of legal action would undermine the president's ability to carry out his or her constitutional duties and is therefore illegitimate. And while he's not spoken specifically on this, I assume that would also mean that he would reject the ability of state courts to effectuate criminal or civil matters against the president. And so this would essentially mean that the president would be beyond the scope of the law while president, potentially meaning a lot of statutes of limitations would run while they were president. All sorts of evidence would atrophy. And if the president got reelected, they could basically just get away with whatever. So he has extreme views on the power of the president generally, and specifically with respect to the special counsel and the force of grand juries.
So now, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the conservative belief that the president shouldn't have much power, that Congress should be having all this power?
No. Going back, I mean, there may have been some statements that they made that sort of sounded like that under Obama, but they actually never really articulated any sort of broad theory, and they've stayed somewhat consistent to a view that they started originating under Nixon and really perfected under Reagan of the unitary executive and the all-powerful president. One cynical way of looking at this is that from 1933 to January 1995, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives for all but 4 years. And so Democrats were considered to be the inherent party of the House of Representatives. And they controlled the Senate for almost all of that time, whereas Republicans were often elected president. And so the presidency was seen as the most likely Republican seat of power. And so Republicans came up with an ideology of extreme deference to the president. Foreign policy concerns also impacted the extremism of this view. National security, state, deference to military and CIA, etc. But Republicans very much believe in a very strong president, and most of the associated legal scholars believe the same. The exceptions they make are for things like the independent agencies, like I mentioned, the SEC, CFPB, FTC, FCC. They don't like independent agencies which are designed to sort of insulate some people to fight on behalf of consumers and competitive markets against corporations. So that part of the executive branch they don't like. But all the types of things that Donald Trump wants to do, they very much believe in a strong executive and have believed so going back to Reagan and Nixon.
During his hearing with the Senate, I believe Senator Cory Booker was asking Brett Kavanaugh about a North Carolina voting rights case that he ruled on. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
I only have a broad brush understanding, but he was essentially, my takeaway from the conversation was that despite the significant empirical evidence that suggests that the voter fraud concerns that voter ID ostensibly addresses are provably illegitimate, and instead voter ID laws are motivated by a desire to make it harder for certain groups, specifically people of color, to vote, that Kavanaugh, in what is a sadly all too common conservative trope, deferred to the state and didn't believe that courts should vindicate the civil rights amendments to the Constitution.
Another issue I see with Brett Kavanaugh is that he does not like the EPA, and that while he believes in climate change, he believes that EPA has no authority. What exactly does that come from?
Kavanaugh is one of the Chamber of Commerce's favorite judges in the country, if not their number one favorite judge, and he basically likes to rule against government agencies implementing laws on behalf of the environment or consumers or workers in different contexts. The D.C. Circuit is so important. Even putting aside that Kavanaugh is up for the Supreme Court, he sits on the D.C. Circuit, which is critical because D.C. is the home to the government agencies like the EPA or like the Department of Labor, FCC, etc. And so the D.C. Circuit is the most influential court in determining administrative law. What are the powers of entities like the EPA versus the powers and rights of business? And he is one of, if not the most consistently pro-business judges in the history of the D.C. Circuit.
While we're talking about this, what I often hear from conservatives is they say, well, they don't like these agencies. They believe the power should go to Congress, and that's where...
Oh, sure, yeah. In America, because we don't have a parliamentary system, there's a separation between the writing of laws and the implementing and effectuating of those laws and enforcing of those laws. And so Congress, obviously with, a president's veto or signature, writes laws, and the executive branch enforces it. And so necessarily Congress cannot constantly be passing super detailed laws on all topics anew every 6 months as facts change. So instead, they pass laws like the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, which provide broad powers to the EPA to develop and enforce rules and regulations to protect the environment. When the executive branch does that and judge seeks to overrule them in claiming because the ruling is too anti-business, they will say that the executive branch was superseding Congress's intent. But that is usually just a fig leaf. That is pretense because Congress passed extremely broad laws demanding, instructing the EPA to protect the environment. And the EPA, when they do protect the environment, they are not overriding Congress's will. They are effectuating it. And the better way for business, if they wanted to undermine this, should be to go to Congress and actually get them to change the instructions that are written into these bedrock environmental statutes. But instead, they claim on an ad hoc, case-by-case basis that corporate interests are actually being impinged in a way that undermines the underlying statute. And it's disingenuous. It's a pretense. And Judge Kavanaugh is very much there for finding such a pretense to be legitimate.
I hear that Judge Kavanaugh here, if appointed to the Supreme Court, would strike down any progressive legislation. And that he's a threat to the Affordable Care Act. Could you explain how that belief comes about?
The Obama administration had to develop certain rules and regulations on how to implement the Affordable Care Act because even though it was a relatively long and complicated piece of legislation, American health care is more complicated than any one given statute can delineate at one time. And the Republicans don't have the votes to actually overturn the ACA, despite their repeated efforts. But they seek to find different legal challenges and to find compliant judges and justices who will find those challenges valid, essentially by just chipping away at the ways in which Health and Human Services and the Center for CMS, Medicaid, and Medicare, the various parts of the executive branch under Obama that wrote rules to implement the ACA, the IRS wrote rules, etc. They go after various different practices that the Obama administration did to implement the ACA. There's a lot of reason to believe Kavanaugh is going to be very open to those sorts of attacks. There's a big case going on in Texas right now. That's another sort of crazy challenge. And I'm not the biggest expert on all the different ups and downs of each of these cases. There are people who know a lot more than I do about healthcare law. But the upshot is that Kavanaugh is considered to be a pretty reliable vote on attacks on the ACA.
Let's say in 2020, Democrats take over the presidency and all the branches of Congress are now theirs, and they decide to pass single-payer health care. You get 60 votes in the Senate, and you get a majority in the House. and let's say Brett Kavanaugh is sitting on the Supreme Court. Isn't that technically going by, how conservatives are arguing that, that Congress should be passing law? Why would they strike that down?
Well, if you look at the way the Roberts Court overruled the Medicaid expansion, the first Obamacare case of the Supreme Court was pretty broadly mischaracterized as a complete win for the Obama administration because the quote-unquote mandate was upheld because it was recognized for what it was, which is just a modest tax if you chose not to have health insurance. But in that case, Medicaid became optional. So, you're living in Florida, and the Medicaid expansion didn't go forward as envisioned in the ACA in Florida because it was left up to the states by the Supreme Court decision in Sebelius. That theory, which was really given very little chance of succeeding by most legal observers, was essentially that the ACA was such a good deal that it would kind of force states to opt in because they'd already opted into Medicaid in the past, and yada, 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 word salad later, this is unconstitutional. And so the takeaway to me is that if you have radical Republicans on the Supreme Court, they can use the magic powers of word salad and more votes on the Supreme Court to basically come up with a constitutional principle that any sort of expansion of social welfare is unconstitutional, which is why I think we should all be very, very concerned about the course of the Supreme Court and what it might mean for any sort of expansion of social democracy.
Obviously, it's in the news now. There's sexual assault complaint against Brett Kavanaugh from when he was a teenager. So what exactly is going on here?
So a woman who had to deal with the fallout of a sexual assault that occurred when she was 15 years old and has been dealing with this, including in therapy with her husband for the past half dozen years, wrote a letter to Senator Feinstein and also a letter to Representative Eshoo of California articulating the fact that she was a victim of sexual assault by Kavanaugh when he was young, but that she did not want to come forward. Feinstein complied with her wishes in not making it well known, but somehow word leaked from one of the offices in the House that there was such a letter. Feinstein confirmed that there was a letter but did not share it. The Republicans accused her of a cover-up, and then on Sunday, the victim said that there have been all these repeated media inquiries. People had kind of figured out who the victim was, and she decided that she did not want it to be the next Anita Hill in terms of the public maelstrom that she was about to enter, but that if she was going to get this sort of scrutiny, she would decide. She was going to take the very courageous step of coming forward and talking about what Brett Kavanaugh and Mark Judge had done to her in 1982.
Okay, so who exactly is Mark Judge?
Mark Judge is a bizarre figure. He's a novelist and pundit and sort of right-wing cultural figure who comes from a prominent family in Washington, D.C., just as Brett Kavanaugh does. He went to Georgetown Prep with Kavanaugh. He's written a book about a novel that is pretty clearly based on his own events about his time at Georgetown Prep, where he talked about being a drunk in high school and made a lot of comments about the sexual escapades that do not really seem to suggest a lot of consent. There's a character in one of Mark Judge's books, Bart O'Kavanaugh, instead of Brett Kavanaugh, who drinks a lot in conjunction with, it was just like a known drunk. So Judge and Kavanaugh apparently actually were friends back in the early 80s. We know that Judge has talked about having been an alcoholic while in high school, and he, until Friday night or Saturday morning, maintained a very bizarre, sexually charged YouTube channel with lots of pictures of very young girls. And Mark Judge has also written a extremely racist piece for the Daily Caller 6 years ago. Mark Judge is a very bad person to be a friend of.
So I just want to clarify here to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. Mark Judge is not a judge or a political figure, I should say. He's just
he's been a political commentator at times. He's written for National Review, Daily Caller, and other right-wing, politically minded outlets. But he is not an elected official. He's not a legal world figure. He's a writer.
So with these sexual assault claims out there. What is the Senate doing on that? What is the Senate's response?
Well, right before we started talking, I believe the latest is that there are indications that as soon as next week there might be an open hearing, that it would include testimony from Ford and from Kavanaugh, but that was just something I saw on Twitter before we started talking, so by the time you write on this, or you can clean up the transcript to reflect what actually, if that's happening. But the Senate Judiciary Committee was scheduled to vote on Thursday this week before yesterday's developments, and for that development, it looked like Kavanaugh was going to clear the committee on a party line vote of 11 to 10. Now it's pretty clear that the Republicans don't have the votes to move the nomination out of committee until there is high-profile hearing, and then how that hearing plays politically will determine whether or not Kavanaugh's nomination makes it out of the Judiciary Committee or not.
You mentioned earlier someone from the Bush administration was reviewing and handing out the documents for Brett Kavanaugh. Now, Brett Kavanaugh has been nominated for roughly, a little over 40 days now? That sound about right?
I think it's now a little more than 2 months, but yeah, roughly.
Okay. So how much of the documents are actually out there for the Senate committee to review?
So there are two sets of documents to discuss. One is when he was in the White House counsel's office. And the precedent set under Elena Kagan was that all of Kagan's Clinton administration White House records were searched by the National Archives and put up online before her hearing under Obama in 2010. The White House counsel records have not actually been, the review of them by the National Archives has not actually finished yet, and no materials from that have been made available by the National Archives at all for Kavanaugh, and they are not expected to be available for another 5 or 6 weeks at this point. The materials that we have seen there's been an expedited process run by a lawyer in private practice by the name of Bill Burke, who has as his client George W. Bush. He was previously Brett Kavanaugh's deputy at the White House. He has also recently represented Judge Kaczynski in the investigation that was going on in the Ninth Circuit. Bill Burke also represents Reince Priebus, Don McGahn, and Steve Bannon in the Mueller investigation. So this guy Bill Burke is the epicenter of all sorts of interesting knowledge and scandals involving Republicans. Burke has made some documents available, like a large number, but not all of the White House counsel documents available. And he is withholding documents from Senate Democrats, and they don't know exactly what he's withholding or whether or not he has anything approaching a legitimate basis. Of the documents that Burke did provide to the Senate, Grassley then tried to block a whole bunch of those documents that even Burke agreed that the Senate Democrats should have, and Grassley tried to call them committee confidential, and apparently did so frequently without a good faith basis. And so it was breaking the determination that some of those documents were committee confidential that led to the Cory Booker showdown with Senator Cornyn. This is all apart and separate from the documents from the time in which Brett Kavanaugh was the staff secretary, which is to say 2003 to 2006 in the Bush White House. Chuck Grassley has decided that no documents from that time are to be made available. And so no one has any documents from that time frame.
Now, is this normal? It sounds like they don't have much documents to go off of. And it sounds like up until this sexual assault claim came out, they were going to, pass him along party line vote. And again, we're talking roughly a little over 40 days after he'd been nominated. Has a Supreme Court nominee gone through that fast?
Some have gone through relatively quickly on people who were much less controversial, but never with such an inadequate record, never with someone who has such a record of public service and so many emails that would be. The process, part of the reason why the slightly complex thing is that Kavanaugh was in the White House counsel's office a few years after Kagan's time, and the volume of email just went up dramatically. So on the issue of the White House counsel, putting aside the staff secretary, part of what's at work is that the Republicans did not want to wait for the National Archives to get through what was a much larger volume of emails to go through than what they experienced with Kagan, just because Kagan was in the 90s and Kavanaugh was in the aughts. And there was just a heavier use of email just in that few-year difference of time. That's the issue of haste, is the not waiting for the archives. The staff secretary thing is just a cover-up. And exactly what is being covered up, I don't know. It's a successful cover-up.
A bunch of Senate Democrats, with the documents they have right at this moment, they've claimed that Brett Kavanaugh has lied already at least 3 or 4 times under oath. Do you know what they're talking about?
Yeah, so as I said, so even while an inadequate number from this time as White House counsel, there's enough to know that he has lied about knowledge of the Manuel Miranda document theft that occurred within the Senate Judiciary Committee when Orrin Hatch had to apologize for the fact that a Republican staffer had stolen documents from the Senate Democrats. Kavanaugh's statement that he did not know about it at the time has been proven to be indefensible with the advent of the documents that we do have. There are 3 specific judicial nominees that he used different language to convey, to distance himself from having worked on them while he was in the White House counsel's office. I think on Pickering and Pryor, it looks really bad what he testified to in the past in light of the documents that are now revealed, especially with respect to Pryor. There's another controversy about Judge Haynes that I think I'm more sympathetic to the interpretation that what he said was broadly true enough, at least to not be perjury or anything. And then there's a controversy over what he said about knowledge about the Bush administration's civil liberties infringements after 9/11, which I think is probably problematic, does not constitute perjury.
What are Senate Republicans' feelings on this? They just dismiss this? We're talking about this email here, at least, with as far as going to his knowledge of hacked emails. And Senate Republicans just seem fine with this?
Well, it's a little hard to say. People have been kind of, as people do in 2018, everyone's been playing horse race pundit from the beginning rather than just trying to analyze stuff like information in a normative sense in real time. Everyone's playing pundit. There hasn't been a lot of Republican objection to the, for instance, the theft of emails, but there's been at least a modest sense that Collins would take it into account as a relevant issue, and she and Murkowski have generally been extremely mum. I think it's a little prejudging to say that those things wouldn't have mattered before the sexual assault issue also came up, but there have been no affirmative signs of Republicans really being mortified by the behavior in the way that you would have hoped they might be.
We've talked about if Brett Kavanaugh ultimately gets elected to the Supreme Court through all this process. What do you think the Democratic response should be come 2020 if they control all 3 branches?
It's a hugely important question. I think one big variable is what we will at that point know about Trump and Russia from the 2016 election, because I think that if Trump was elected legitimately, even if via all sorts of freak occurrences and after all sorts of horrifying behavior and racist statements and misogyny and the like, but if he's a legitimate president, I think it's going to be, I am skeptical that you will see anything like court packing occur. However, if Robert Mueller were to prove that the Trump administration did conspire with Russian assets to cheat in the election, or that the NRA conspired with Russian assets to cheat in the election, if there was significant cheating in an election decided by very, very narrow margins, I think that would kind of require Democrats to strongly consider telling Gorsuch and Kavanaugh that they can either resign from the court, additional justices will be added to nullify their votes.
So why would you be skeptical of court packing? Let's just say if everything comes out that Trump was legitimately, by legal reason, elected, and 2020 Democrats control all 3 branches of Congress, why would you be skeptical of court packing?
Because I think that while I would still probably support it, I would be conflicted because I do think that there's a worry that there's no limiting principle to stop then the next time there's a Republican president from them increasing the number at that time. And granted, bizarrely, the Supreme Court is not, the number of justices is not delineated in the Constitution. It has varied over time. This makes no sense to me, but it is true. And so it's not like there's illegitimacy in adding justices. But I think that if there's no limiting principle as to why you're adding the justice positions to the Supreme Court other than do not like their decisions, I think that's not a great precedent to set and just kind of further undermines necessary undergirding of norms in a society in which we have a very weak Constitution, a very broad document that's a little archaic. I know I'm saying that on National Constitution Day. Whereas if your limiting principle is that if you get caught cheating in an election, your lifetime appointments are viewed differently than if you were not caught cheating, that strikes me as a pretty defensible proposition whereby in democratic theory, if we give power to the presidency based off of winning an election and you cheated, you shouldn't get the benefit of the presidency that you cheated to get. So I just think it's a limiting principle that could hopefully start pushing us back to rule of law, but also, I'm sympathetic to people who say, well, Merrick Garland was denied a seat, and that was a pretty significant transgression against norms, and this Kavanaugh appointment is obviously violating all sorts of notions of decency. So all bets are off. But I suspect we're going to find out that Trump cheated in the election. We sort of know most of that already, and I'd rather hold court packing to the narrow situation of being caught cheating in an election rather than just saying you do it when you don't like the members of the Supreme Court.
I'd like to once again thank Jeff Hauser for taking time out of his busy schedule to talk about Brett Kavanaugh. I hope you found this as informative as I did. Thank you.